Kyle will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions. Again, thank you, Kyle, for joining us. We'll get started. Daina Ramey Berry is the Michael Douglas Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Before joining UCSB, she was the Oliver A. Radke Regents Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at the University of Texas at Austin. She also served as the Associate Dean of the Graduate School. In addition to her work at the university as an administrator and internationally recognized scholar of slavery, Professor Berry is one of the most sought-after consultants for public-facing projects offered by museums, historical sites, K-12 educational initiatives, syndicated radio programs, online podcasts, and public television. Professor Berry completed her BA, MA, and PhD in African American Studies and U.S. History at the University of California, Los Angeles. She is a scholar of the enslaved and a specialist on gender and slavery, as well as Black women's history in the United States. Berry is an award-winning author and editor of 6 books and several scholarly articles. One of her recent books, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from Womb to Grave in the Building of a Nation, received 3 book awards, including the Phyllis Wheatley Award for Scholarly Research from the Sons and Daughters of the U.S. Middle Passage, the 2018 Best Book Prize from the Society for the History of Early American Republic, and the 2018 Hamilton Book Prize from the University Co-op for the Best Book among UT Austin faculty. Berry's book was also a finalist for the 2018 Frederick Douglass Book Prize, awarded by Yale University and the Gilder Lehrman Institute in New York. Dr. Berry has appeared on several syndicated radio and television networks, including PBS, NewsHour, NBC, TLC, MSNBC, CNN, C-SPAN, National Geographic Explorer, and NPR. In 2016, she also served as a historical consultant and technical advisor for the remake of Roots by Alex Haley, where she worked with the writers on the script and advised on set by supporting the directors and actors during filming. She currently serves as a consultant for museums and historical societies through the United States, including the restoration and interpretation at historic sites such as the Owens-Thomas House, the Phillipsburg Manor, and the Neil Cochrane House. In 2018, Berry produced several online essays during Black History Month for the National Museum of African American History and Culture in collaboration with biography.com and history.com, and edited the text for the award-winning People Not Property website on slavery in the North. She is also the co-producer with Adrienne Hopper Williams for a multimedia series on women's contributions to United States history called Making History Hers. Dr. Berry has received prestigious fellowships for her research from the National Endowment for the Humanities, American Council of Learned Societies, the American Association of University Women, and the Ford Foundation. She is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, Washington Post, and Huffington Post. She has also received grants from the Mellon Foundation, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, as well as the Spencer Foundation of Humanities, Texas, to work with K-12 educators on teaching the history of slavery to American youth via the Texas Domestic Slave Trade Project. Professor Berry is the Associate Director for the Journal of African American History and one of the lead authors of McGraw-Hill's revised high school and middle school U.S. history textbooks. In 2020, she published A Black Woman's History of the United States with Professor Callie Nicole Gross of Emory University, which received several awards and widespread recognition, including being selected as a finalist for a 2021 NAACP Image Award in Literacy Nonfiction. The Young Readers version will be published in 2023. She is currently finishing a book on the myths of slavery for Beacon Press and a biography of Anna Murray Douglas for Yale University Press. Dr. Berry is a fellow of the Society for American Historians and The American. Dr. Berry, it is indeed a privilege and an honor to be here with you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the audience is looking forward to it. And again, thank you for just being here, your willingness to engage with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm a pleasure to be here. And when I was looking at the opening slides, it brought back memories of my time at the National Humanities Center. And for those of you that have not visited the campus there, I encourage you to do the summer workshops or stop by if you're in the area in the Research Triangle Park. It was very formidable years for me to be there during those 2 years in late 2007 to 29. And I wrote the book that I'm going to be talking a lot about tonight, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. The majority of the thoughts about that project came out of conversations with fellows and that I engaged with while I was there at the National Humanities Center. So I'm going to talk tonight about the ideas of Black bodies being commodified from preconception to postmortem and understanding the value of Black life during slavery. And I want to begin with a quote. "It is not the color of the skin that makes the man or the woman, but the principle formed in the soul. Brilliant wit will shine, come from whence it will, and genius and talent will not hide the brightness of its luster." That is a quote from Maria Stewart, one of the first American women to speak in front of public audiences in the 19th century. I like to begin with the voices of formerly enslaved people, and you'll see this in terms of how I center my teaching. And what I want to do with you all this evening is to talk about structural ways to teach African American history and the history of slavery, and then to talk about an experienced part of slavery, how Black bodies were treated as commodities over time. Now, African American history, as you all know today, has been in the headlines, not only in the last 24 to 48 hours, but also for the last 5 to 10 years, and even longer than that. We know that the McGraw-Hill textbook controversy, where a Houston mother called out the textbook company for referring to African American enslaved people as workers, and that encouraged the company to embrace change. And I was happy to be a part of that change and rewriting that textbook for both middle school and high school. And some of you may see that in your classrooms, and some of you may come across that at libraries. But it was a long effort that took years, and it's also part of this movement to include the experiences of all people that have populated and contributed to the United States. And my role in that has been to work on African American history, and in particular the history of enslavement. As you know, the College Board just released yesterday the AP for African American Studies course curriculum. And I'll read a quote here from the board, David Coleman. "When you read the framework, it is an unflinching encounter with the facts and evidence of African American history and culture." And that's really what I try to do and try to think about in terms of how I teach history. I want you to think about African American people as in their humane self as human beings. And I know that sounds funny, and I say this all the time. And I want to begin with this image here, this image of African Americans that were enslaved. And think about what does it mean to teach history, what constitutes history, and how can we teach more inclusive histories so that the students in your classrooms will feel like there was a place for them in the past, right? So this is an image of an enslaved community. Many of you have probably seen this image. We now have the capability to zoom in and go close to images like this, and you'll see details like whether or not people are wearing shoes. You'll see feathers on hats. You might see jewelry. You might see earrings. In some photos, when you see these large photos of plantation communities, you'll find sometimes nursing women, not in this particular image. But I encourage you when you're pulling images from online resources, like Slavery Images, which is out of the University of Virginia, out of the Virginia Foundation for the Humanities. They have most of the images that I use. The National Museum for African American History and Culture has digitized and produced all kinds of collections and museum quality images that you can use in your classrooms. I want to say one benefit, and I don't even know if that's the right word, it might be too optimistic, but one outcome, how about that? One outcome of the pandemic was that libraries were forced to digitize, in ways to keep scholars and researchers active and to keep their doors open. And so the digitization has changed the way in which we can teach history, the way in which I engage with graduate students, and the ways in which I hope you can engage with students of all ages in the communities that you're in. One of the things that I do when I teach African American history is I think about African American history. I do not start with enslavement, although I showed you this image right away. I have this arc of African American history. It's very simple. It's a very simple framework. If I was teaching an entire course on the African American experience, I would focus on freedom because African people were free before they were enslaved. I have to say that again. African people were free before they were enslaved. They were free, they were captive, they became captives, then they were enslaved, and during enslavement, they resisted, and then became free once again. So anytime I present African American history to young children, to middle school children, high school children, to college students, community college students, I make sure that we focus on the fact that African Americans come from a community of freedom and free people. And I think that's a really important starting point. And a lot of the textbooks, I can say this, a lot of the new revised textbooks are including information about the history of life in different parts of Africa. And they're looking at freedom in Africa. And I always encourage you to think about showing the experience in life and culture, showing African universities, showing that there was trade, there were tax systems, irrigation systems, communities that thrived in Africa. And prior to European contact, look at Kush, you can look at Timbuktu as an institution, and show students African American, excuse me, I keep saying African American, I'm jumping ahead in the history here. Show students African freedom and begin with freedom and begin with an exploration of African American culture and African American, excuse me, I said it again, African cultural ways, right? So think about that, and there's lots of ways that you can teach this and show images of freedom in Africa. Once we move from freedom, the next arc is captivity. And I know that some of you may be working with and interacting with younger children, but you'd be surprised by setting that up on how well younger generations and younger children do with talking about this history if it's presented to them in very plain ways. I've said this on many occasions. Some of the deepest conversations that I have had about the institution of slavery and about the experience of African Americans in slavery has come from conversations with 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, where they ask deep questions because they ask deep questions about how and why people were traded and treated like commodities, and why they ask questions about the Civil War and why different groups of people. I had one student say, well, that means I couldn't have gone to school with my buddy, looking at an African American classmate, or we couldn't have drinking out of the same water faucet. I said, yes, that's true. And so we talk about what that means and why that happened. So captivity is a difficult aspect of the African and African American experience. We have sketches and images of Africans being captured. They're captured before they're enslaved, and they're put on small boats and brought out to ships that they're then counted and kept in very, very detailed records through the Slavery Voyages. I recommend that website, Slavery Voyages. It's now out of Rice University. This is generations of scholars that have cataloged the history of captivity on slave ships and the experiences of Africans leaving and being forcibly removed from their homelands and being brought across the Atlantic through the Middle Passage into New World enslavement. So images of captivity are here, but just setting that up and talking about this. One of the things, I don't have a slide for this tonight, but one thing I show it because students always ask, why didn't they resist? And I always answer they did. And we can find evidence of resistance at every single stage of their captivity, of their enslavement, and up until African people and African descended people became free. Captivity, though, had tools such as shackles, such as mouth muzzles, such as neck braces or bells on their foreheads, all kinds of things that they would put to shackle individuals to keep them chained in the bellies of these enslaved ships. That's another reason why it's difficult, but you do see mutiny, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So captivity is a really important moment. And I think it's important to show this in this arc of African American history, because you need to show the transition from freedom to them being forcibly captured into enslavement. There's a capture experience there. There's an action that was taken upon against people of African descent. And after that, then they are on the ocean, and we know a lot about that now, thanks to scholars like Stephanie Smallwood, Shawande Mustakim, and a host of others who have written about this history on the Atlantic waters. We know that Africans were taken along. I showed this slide oftentimes. These slave ships went to multiple ports before they started crossing the Atlantic. 3,500 miles of West African coastline to stop and pick up, quote unquote, human cargo, the human cargo that they will then bring to New World plantation communities. And as I mentioned, at every step of the way, they mutinied and tried to fight against their enslavement. And women were involved in this because oftentimes women on slavers were not kept in chains underneath in the belly of the ship. They were also being sexually exploited and used by crewmen, and they knew the physical geography of these ships. They knew where the captain's cabin was. Some of them knew. Some of them knew. They knew what time people ate, what time they went to bed. They knew that this seaman got sick or drank too much. And they also knew where the tools were hidden and some of the supplies. So mutinies aboard slave ships involved in women and men fighting against their captivity in hopes to become free once more. I want to pause and see if anyone are there any questions before I move into more details about enslavement and then going into the commodification of the bodies. Are there questions for me?
At this point, everyone's just communicating and engaging among themselves in the audience chat. There were a few questions about the website, so we included the slavevoyages.org website in there as well. And there's just in general comments about their approaches to actually, teaching, the history of African Americans in this country. I will say I found it illuminating your approach when discussing the arts of the African American experience, starting with freedom and how regularly teachers tend to, whether for convenience or lack of a true understanding of it, not delving into the actual African history, West African histories of these African, soon to be African Americans. So no questions at this time, but I will be sure to keep my eyes on the chat. One just popped in from Giancarlo. He asked, how often would mutinies occur on ships during that time? If you have that information, how often would mutinies?
I don't have the exact figures, but I can probably put some sources together because there are a number of scholars that write about the mutinies on slave ships. I don't have a number. We know that there were thousands and thousands of voyages. You probably have heard, many of you probably have heard of Amistad and some of the other more well-known revolts, but there were also small revolts that happened. They might not have been quote unquote successful, depending on how you define success in this setting. But they happened regularly, and some of them were small attempts, others were large, where ships were turned around and there were court cases involved, and all kinds of international battles on who owns the bodies of those enslaved people that were on these ships. So I apologize for not having a specific figure on that, but that's a great question.
Okay, and that's all for now, Dr. Berry. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So now I want to shift to enslavement as the next period. And one of the things that I always do when I teach the history of slavery, and I encourage you all to do the same, is to, as I mentioned, focus on the humanity of the enslaved, but also, if you can, create a classroom that has a sensory experience. I try to teach the history of slavery through the senses, which sounds very difficult to do. But and you might have to be careful depending on the age of the children that you're working with or the students that you're working with. But I try to have them think about the senses and what does it mean to see enslavement? What does it mean to smell? And how do I do smell? I bring in liquid smoke because if you walk across plantation communities, they're often burning the crops and burning the fields to get ready for the next harvest. And there's a certain scent. Those of you that are from the South know what scent I'm talking about. But there's a certain scent that sort of illuminates in the air. And so that's how I do the scent of slavery. I bring in raw cotton. I allow them to touch it, to feel it, to see what it's like to have your hand scraped by the bowl of cotton when you go in to take it out. I'll allow, if students want to see that, to think about the weight of cotton. The sounds of enslavement. I use sound by listening to hymnals and songs and playing songs that enslaved people sang. You know that the National Archives and the Library of Congress have the audio files of some enslaved people talking about their experience in their interviews through the Workers' Progress Administration, and that's online as well. There are also books, The Sounds of Slavery, where you can have audio files as well of songs that enslaved people sang, or quote unquote, I'm using the dated term here, Negro spirituals. So hearing the voices of formerly enslaved people tell their story is very, very powerful. It's more powerful than you reading a narrative to them or the students reading the text for themselves. So I encourage that. Taste, for tasting slavery, we had a cookbook from a plantation, an old cookbook that we found. There's a number of archives that have African-American cookbooks from the 19th century, and students made different dishes and cornbread and a few other things, and we ate and tasted the kinds of food that enslaved people might have eaten during that time. So I'm not saying that you do all that, but I was just giving you all an example of ways in which you can work in the senses. And the reason why I shifted to this methodology, in addition to covering the arc of history, when you talk about slavery and you're covering slavery, it can be a very heavy classroom experience. And you do not know how students will respond. And they don't know how they'll respond. Some might have an emotional response that they didn't know was coming. Some might be overwhelmed by the material. Some might be angered by it. Some might be ashamed by it. Some might just feel disturbed and not really want to engage in a conversation, okay? So one of the things that I think about is the senses kind of brings us in and allows us to be a little bit more present and think about the institution of slavery in other ways, visual ways, sound waves, and also through touch, okay? So those are just some ideas. Now, when we talk about the subject for tonight about understanding the value of Black bodies from preconception to postmortem, I wanted to share with you that enslaved people were valued before they were born and after they died. They were thought about before they had a name. They talked about women and their future increase. And Jennifer Morgan, a historian at NYU, writes about women and their future increase. They're making projections on whether or not women are going to give birth to healthy children in the future and whether or not those children will survive. We know that the levels of infant mortality were high, meaning that some women gave birth and the children did not make it by the time they reached their 9 months of pregnancy. Sometimes they were giving birth to stillborn infants, and sometimes those children die within the first few years of their lives because of the extreme conditions, the lack of care that mothers had during slavery, and the overwork that they had as enslaved laborers. So they were valued even before they were born. Women, when you look at women and as they approach puberty, enslavers and their managers were making projections on whether or not these women could give birth to healthy children, and their values, their monetary values, were calculated based on this idea of them bringing an additional source of labor that this enslaver did not have to purchase on the auction block. So there's a difference when women are giving birth to children than having to go purchase an enslaved child. And we'll talk about prices in a few minutes. So that's what you see, that with the enslaved people as commodities could be purchased. They could be gifted, as part of a dowry and a wedding. They were deeded and they were also used to secure loans. We have evidence of enslaved people raffled at political auctions, and a slew of other modes of commerce that enslaved people were sort of being treated, as I say, as a form of legal tender. Just sit with that for a minute. One way to think about this, we know early on in the 1970s, scholars were writing about the connection between the price of enslaved people and the price of cotton, and they saw some correlations with that, and they saw that over time that there was a correlation there. And that was one of the first ways that people were talking about slave prices. What I wanted to do with this idea of understanding that they were valued before they were born and even after they died, was to think about every single stage of the life cycle. How can we identify the value? And my real question was, what did enslaved people know or think about their value? Did they understand, and when, at what age did they understand that they were being treated as a commodity? And how did they make sense of that? How did they cope with that? How did they respond to that? And how did they react to that? Those are the questions that drove my study. And so initially, when I was at the Humanities Center, I started creating a database of prices. I was calling them prices. Now I've shifted to values, because the price is a price of something is really when it's at its highest value, it's when it's in the market and it's being traded, right? But a value, they're placing value on these bodies at different stages. And each plantation, for tax purposes, had to keep an inventory of all their property, china, bedding, livestock, and human beings. They had to put all of this in a record and sort of put an inventory of how much that person or that item, that good of theirs, was valued. And part of this was for tax purposes. So you'll see these lists, and they keep meticulous records, which I'll show you a few in a minute, very meticulous records. And they'll put a value, an appraised value on an enslaved person, okay? And that appraised value is not necessarily how much they would be worth if they were sold at auction, but it's a value of what they were at the moment that they were being appraised at that time during that year. So we have lots of images of enslaved people being sold at auctions and being put on the auction block, of family separation, of children, of young mothers with their babies in their arms, like this young woman, the woman in the bottom of the screen, and the woman with an adolescent or a young adolescent clinging to her mother before she's being auctioned off. Now, black bodies on some estates were divided numerically, and they were divided into a 4-point system. They were either a quarter hand, a half hand, a 3/4 hand, or a whole, or one, okay? And what does that mean? That's sort of a gradation that some enslavers and their managers use to classify the amount of work that an enslaved person can perform in a given day. So one was like a prime, they called it A1 prime. That sort of sounds like some meat to me, but we can talk about that in Q&A later. But A1 prime, or a full hand, that person can do a full amount of work in a given day. Then you have, they're graded below that. So then a 3/4 hand does 3/4 the amount of work that a full hand does. And sometimes they would even calculate what that meant and how much work that was, whether that was on a task system where they had a specific amount of tasks that they had to complete in a given day, or if it was with gang labor, they would try to make sure all the full hands were in the same row, and then the next group of workers were 3/4 hands. They try to keep you with someone at your same pace, so that as you're working through the fields, whether you're on a cotton plantation or you're cultivating sugar or rice or others, that you were with workers that can move around the same pace as you. So that is one, like, when you look at that valuation and you think about that, it's evidence of how planters literally commodified the bodies to the level of work that enslaved people can perform. And you even find in the plantation records, Will, they might have 50 enslaved workers, and then it'll say, which equals 26 and a half hands. So they're even thinking about the work and how they organize the work based on the amount of work that they can extract from these bodies. And the value is always being thought about, always being calculated, and always recorded. Other images, you guys have probably seen some of these. The images at the auction block, we do know that there are some auctions, like the Great Auction in Savannah, where over 400 enslaved people were sold on the Butler Plantation, where there was an effort to keep families together, and we see that. But then we also find that when they couldn't keep them together, they went ahead and abandoned that, and sometimes just went on to selling families separate. And we do find, that was one of the questions that I was trying to discover with the research, was, were families kept together? And it varied. It really did. So if you're teaching young children and you're talking about this very, very difficult history, and you're talking about family separation, sometimes I would use a story from someone the age of the class that I'm teaching. So I might read a part of a narrative or an age-appropriate book for a fifth grader or a third grader, whatever grade I'm consulting with or working with, and I talk about, like, I try to talk about it from that perspective. And what do you think what do you think about this? Or, like, here's this young kid, and here's a story of how they experienced slavery. Oftentimes, what I learned was by the age of six, enslaved children had tough lessons to learn. They grew up witnessing people leaving the plantation or the small farm or wherever they lived. They witnessed that. They witnessed separations. They may not have fully understood it, but their parents or the people that served as parents for them often educated them, and they told them, you might play with Billy today, but he might own you tomorrow. You might be buddies with him. He's your playmate or she's your playmate, but they might own you. And there's a separation that occurs. And that moment is a very powerful moment in a young child's life on both Black children and white children's experiences. From the records that I've read, they really struggle with that moment. And one father had to tell his son, I know that he's starting to hit you. You need to hit him back, so he knows that he can't control you that way. And so, but this is my buddy. I don't want to fight him. Why is he being mean to me? These are the kinds of questions that you see in records that teach us about how enslaved children and white children learned about the differences of their lives at a very pivotal moment in a very interesting and important stage of their development and growth. Another auction scene, lots of these auction scenes you've seen these images of. You could also show, depending on the age, clips from films. You may not show full movies. You could decide what you think is appropriate, but there's been a number of films. We have the 1977 Roots. We have the 2016 version of Roots. We also have a number of documentaries that have been done about slavery. The African American, many Rivers Across African American Lives has a 6-part series that Henry Louis Gates did. And you also have a number of other documentary films and feature films like 12 Years a Slave that you could use to show portions that you felt would be appropriate to give students a visual. I took a college level class, to see 12 Years of a Slave. We had been studying this history for, I think, 9 weeks of the semester, and we were getting prepared for the movie. And we knew a lot about the experience. We focused on the experience of the enslaved, and even with all the prep that we had to go see that film was difficult for some of the students. Very, very difficult. Just to have the visual and the audio was a different experience for them, and some of them had a difficult time, although we did a lot to prepare. So I think I would be careful with what you choose, but I think it's important for us to know this history because it is a part of our American past that we need to talk about, and we need to find ways to talk about it that are appropriate, age appropriate. So this is a major image of an auction in New Orleans, major auction house there. And here, another Slaves Waiting to Sale. This is a very famous sketch. Do I need to pause for questions before I move further?
Indeed, indeed. We have a few questions that have come in, and also I have a few observations that actually are born of my experience growing in the South. When you were describing earlier the burning, invoking the senses of students by channeling that image in our minds of the fields being cleared at the end of the season to prepare for planting. So that really stood out for me. But then also I recall a feature that you did on an episode of Teaching Hard History, where you mentioned that parents had to teach their children that they were both people and commodities. Yeah. And so as you were explaining that just now, that popped into my mind, and I just remember that, just how troubling it was to hear that. And so again, just thank you for making those points. There were a couple of questions. One question that Gregory had early on was, is mutiny the preferred term as opposed to rebellion or uprising? He was wondering in terms of framing.
Good question. So I think it's more of a term, that's a term that you'll see more in the historical records. So that I actually was using the term that I see in records, because most of my research is based on primary documents that I find, and I try to use those to talk about the history that way. So mutiny, you'll see that listed like a mutiny aboard an enslaver or slaver. I've spent a lot of time with definitions, so I appreciate the question. Some people talk about rebellions and uprisings interchangeably, and also the term revolt. Some of what happened on ships were revolt that didn't necessarily cause. I'll use success. Let me define success in this conversation. For me, success would be if they freed themselves, right? I'm just going to be very simplistic here for the purpose of this discussion. So a successful rebellion would be that they became free, right? Or they somehow got free. And for some people, freedom meant transitioning to the afterlife and into death. So they didn't care if they were on a ship. Sometimes if whatever they were experiencing at that time, they wanted to escape from it and be done with it. And if that meant death, freedom was death to them.
That's a great segue into the next question, which was from Claudia, who was asking if they were successful in freeing themselves from their captors during the Atlantic voyage, where did they end up going? And her question followed his, where they end up going back to Africa, or well, but you described that. I mean, yeah, they were freeing themselves,
Right. Great question as well. So one on ships, what we find, and I can give you some, I'm going to try to rack my brain here while we're here tonight, but many of the major cases that we've read about became court cases. So they might have successfully overthrown the ship. They became court cases, like the Amistad case, and there was a battle over who owns and where they should go. There are a few scholars now that have found evidence where there are some that made it back to Africa, but very few. Many were in a court system and then sold, or some were then freed into the Caribbean. But the numbers are not as high as one might want to see. I think it's more of the effort, the effort of wanting to be free. And that's why, again, we're grounding this conversation in freedom. Really helps us understand the resistance of people of African descent, not at every stage of their experience of captivity, because freedom is an inherent quality that everybody has a desire for. And I think when you look at what happened on these slave ships, whether they made it back, I think there's only a few. There's a few scholars that have just recently written about that, where there were some triumphant stories where people did make it back to parts of West Africa.
Okay. Thank you for that. And have a question from Bridget Campbell, who is originally from the South, but who now teaches in California. And her question is, it starts out with a statement, but she says, I grew up in the South, so knowing about slavery and the Civil War felt like something I just always knew about. I'm a second career teacher now teaching in California with predominantly Hispanic students and their middle schoolers. And yesterday I realized that they not only don't know what the Civil War is, yet they're not even really sure what slavery is. I found myself introducing it, and then I got worried that I was introducing the idea that African Americans were somehow less than. And I got really worried about that. I wasn't sure what is the right way to introduce slavery. This may sound so naive, and I apologize, but you're clearly an amazing resource to ask.
No, it's not naive. That's a great question.
Hmm.
And it's
Absolutely.
also really interesting and good feedback for me to hear that, to learn, to know that there are still um, students in this younger generation that don't know about slavery, which to me is amazing. It says something about the work that we need to do in our educational system. So I just want to thank all the teachers that are here for the work that you do, because it is some of the most important work, shaping young minds and helping them learn about who we are and where we came from. So slavery was a part, and you can think about this way. Slavery was a part of most systems in the world. Like most nations had some form of slavery or enslavement, different kinds of slavery. We had in this country what we call chattel slavery, which is, chattel, chattel, which is where a movable form of property. That's very different than slavery in other parts of the world and other societies. So I would introduce it broadly so that slavery is not necessarily linked only to people of African descent. I think that's one starting point, and that will help so that the students can have a broad understanding of an institution that also has different levels of how people experience captivity. So, for instance, in some parts of West Africa, there were communities where people that were enslaved, and some people wouldn't even use the word enslaved there, but they were more like prisoners of war, and they were, but they could vote, they could serve as political advisors, they could marry. What's different about what happened in the United States and parts of the Caribbean is that in the United States we had chattel slavery where it became hereditary. So you were born into this institution, and it was difficult, freedom, which that's a whole nother conversation, but you were born into this institution and you either stole your freedom, you were either gifted or given your freedom through manumission, or you were emancipated at some point in your life, or when slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. So that's how I would introduce slavery as an institution that many world societies and communities had that kept people in captivity over others. And that had different meaning in different communities. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we have maybe 4 more questions, and I can
Sure.
hold off on those, or I can go ahead and present them now. It's your whatever you would like on those. We can save them till the end.
No, go ahead. We can go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, 'cause I'm going to move into
Very good.
some stuff in a minute. So, yeah.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. And Kyle, who's our TA for the evening, he has a question. He says, was there a sense of people manipulating the value of enslaved people in order to pay less in taxes? I've also heard of the idea that some people even didn't record some of their enslaved people in the census or other documents to avoid taxes. Did you run across that?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. So this is when I talk about values and how we value the body, the black body during slavery. I mentioned earlier that there's a price, which is the sale price. So there's a sale price, there's an appraisal price, which is what you see in their books, which is what you're talking about here for tax purposes. So there's an appraisal price, there's a sale price at the auction or at a market, or whether it's a private sale or a sheriff's sale. There's all kinds of sales, but there's a sale price. Then I also talk about I talk about these as values. So the value, there's another value that I'll talk about in a few minutes, the soul value, the value of the soul, and that is the price that enslaved people put on their bodies, which was infinite. It had no price. It was the value of themselves as a human being, and that could not be commodified. And that's a very important aspect of how I teach this history. And I think one of the readings is Soul Values in American Slavery, which sort of elaborates on that point. And then I'm going to shift into a few minutes about ghost values. And that is the value of the enslaved person's cadaver. Because when I was doing this research, I learned that even after people died, some of their bodies, not all, some of their bodies were sold, their cadavers were sold to universities and medical schools for anatomical research and for human anatomy classes. And I have to say, when I learned that, I was floored, because here I was, had been studying slavery through graduate school, as an early career scholar, been teaching slavery for 10, 15 years at the time, and stumbled on this and just didn't really know what to do with it, and didn't know how to unpack it. So the value of the body goes across, as I mentioned, before they're born, but also after they die. That's why the framing, the bookends are preconception to postmortem. So they did do this in their tax records, in their books. The reason why the appraisal price is not necessarily an accurate reflection of the actual value of that person at that time is because they sometimes would sort of generalize those values and make them lower so that they didn't have to pay the kind of taxes on the enslaved. So that's absolutely something that happened. And also to counting census records, we have to always, as historians, we use primary documents to help us understand a moment or a time period. And we have to use multiple records. So we might use an estate inventory, and we may be fortunate to have a census record from that same estate. And we can look and see, well, wait a minute, this document says they have 33 people. This one says they have 23, So that's one place. I can't fully say that that's what they were doing, but we do find that there's been some misrepresentation in the records. And I want to just pause and one thing real quick. I've been talking about slavery this evening as plantation slavery, and I have to say that we are now, scholars have moved into, for a number of years now, thinking about slavery in very diverse spaces. So to go back to the other question about how do you introduce it, slavery in the United States, we often have this visual of a cotton plantation, right? And I have some images on the next slide I'll show you, where we have these images of cotton plantations and people in the fields, right? But we know that they worked on multiple crops, tobacco, rice, sugar, wheat. They had subsistence farming. They produced corn, but also outside of plantation settings, enslaved people labored in industrial settings, in factories, in mines, coal mines, iron factories, brick making factories, right? So there's other spaces. They also worked in urban areas, in butcher shops, in private homes, by the wharf, sort of loading ships, as seamstresses and ironers, in small houses and for businesses. So we think about slavery. We often have this image that you see here on the screen of people in cotton fields, but urban forms of slavery and enslavement at universities, and I'm going to talk in a few minutes about slavery at medical colleges, is another form of the institution that we really haven't talked about as much as plantation slavery. So I just want to make sure that you all don't leave this thinking that Black people were enslaved in picking cotton in the fields. We now know of many more spaces, and we now have evidence of many more spaces that we can talk about to do this and to understand this history.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. This is mind-blowing. There was a collective gasp when you mentioned the examinations following death and how the cadavers were donated to medical centers. We have a few other questions which have come in. I want to commend the teachers tonight because they're really populating the managed Q&A box. So big shout out to the teachers tonight for all of your questions. So a question we have, following up on teaching enslaved children the class differences between enslaved and white children, how common or integrated were social interactions between white families and enslaved people?
Can you repeat the first part of the question again?
Yes. Following up on teaching enslaved children the class differences between them or between enslaved and white children, how common or integrated were social interactions between white families and enslaved people?
Okay. Thank you for the question. One of the things I always say is slavery is a very intimate institution, particularly when you have people living in the same house, sometimes those that were quote unquote domestic slaves or non-agricultural slaves that were living in the houses. Some of their parents might have been the butler in the house, and the mom might have been a cook or seamstress, and their children were being raised, their black children were being raised up in that house with other white children. So in that setting, very, very close contact, day-to-day contact, especially with there's young children. As I mentioned earlier, they played together before they were later separated. So you find that there's a lot of connections there. As I mentioned, as they age, though, there's a deeper separation that you see because of the institution, because it became a racialized institution, right? Because of that, you had to have that separation so that the one class could rule over the other. And that's how it sort of became. You also see at the Library Company of Philadelphia, they have records there of children's books for white children to teach them about slavery. And that would be really interesting if you all could. I don't know if they've digitized that book. There's a couple books there, and I do mention them in the book, The Price for the Pound of Flesh. But they're giving them lessons about, how to understand and think about and interact with young black children. And they're all age-appropriate books, which is kind of interesting, for lack of a better word. So there's we have evidence in cultural settings and ways in which their parents were trying to educate, both black and white parents were educating their children on what it meant to be enslaved and what it meant to be free.
Okay. Next up, we have a question, and we've had a few questions about approaches to introducing the topic of slavery in the lower elementary level. And so, for example, Alberto has a question that says, I teach second grade in Southern California. Slavery is not taught until fifth grade. How can I approach it at the lower elementary level? My dream is to teach this in an age-appropriate way across the lower grades.
That's a great question. I actually should have provided a link. I wrote a curriculum with two other scholars in the College of Education at UT Austin on a fifth grade curriculum, and we tested it out with children. I'm happy if I can give them the link later. I'd be happy to share it. And it's very interactive, and it has the kids read some age-appropriate books about slavery and different experiences that I think really work their way into younger generations. There are a number of, one way to introduce it to is through the number of scholars. I wish I could remember this woman's name right now. There's a couple books that just received major book awards that relate to African American history and slavery for younger generations. But it's really just talking in plain terms to them about the ways in which people at different times in our history, how we had systems of the way we function that pitted groups against or over other groups. And in that time period, this is what it looked like. And then just describe it to them. Maybe have a children's book that you could read that they would learn about it. Also maybe showing them some images and just say, for 300 plus years in the United States, African American people were enslaved. And what did that mean? So what did that mean? And to tell them what it meant. It meant that they worked, if they were in a plantation setting, from sunup to sundown. If they were in a home, they were serving young kids. When they were real young, they didn't have, quote unquote, the skills to work out in the fields or to work at a home. They sometimes were fanning the flies off of their enslavers. They were bringing water to the fields if they were in a plantation setting, or making the coffee in the morning, or learning how to set a table. These were some of the tasks that young children did before they became enslaved. And you see in this image, there are children that are very young that are in the fields. And you also see, as I mentioned earlier, thinking about when you present this, if you think about the arc so that it's not so jarring, and you teach it by the arc: freedom, captivity, enslavement, resistance, freedom. If you make sure you keep that in mind, I think it helps keep the humanity front and center. So you have an ad here for $250, a $250 reward for 3 Negro girls. So you'll find tons. There's a number of websites, Freedom on the Move out of Cornell, and also the Texas Runaway Slave Trade Project has, and also those are websites. Hopefully you guys can get links for that. the Texas Runaway Slave Trade Project, Freedom on the Move, as well as information wanted ads that are from Forever Free. That's a website out of Villanova. These are all transcribed advertisements, runaway advertisements of enslaved people. But except for the information wanted ads that are on Forever Free, or Last Seen ads. They're called the Last Seen ads, based on a book by Heather Andrea Williams called Help Me to Find My People. And these were advertisements on that website where Black families during slavery and even afterwards were putting ads in newspapers trying to find relatives of theirs that were separated from them during slavery. And it's amazing to see that and contrast that ad with the runaway slave ad, which was often written from the perspective of the enslaver trying to track down an enslaved person who ran away. They're both looking for people, right? One's looking for their quote-unquote human property. The other is looking for a family member, a loved one. And those ads are short and they're small, and it's a great primary document that you could use in the classroom that allows the students to learn the history from the documents. And, I just have, again, the National Museum of African American History and Culture has amazing images. All the images on this page are from there. As I mentioned, museum quality. Those are the shackles. So when students say, well, why did they run away? Imagine those being on your ankle. You can only shuffle step, right? You can't run with something like that around your ankle. So just to think about it and allow them to see some of the tools of slavery and to allow them to understand the institution from documents and images that come from that time period.
Thank you for sharing all those resources. I want to point out that I believe I located the 5th grade curriculum and dropped it in the chat, Learning from U.S. History, a 5th grade social studies curriculum. We have that there. And there's also a link in the chat to the Last Scene. And also I plugged one of our 2021 webinars from Dr. Williams, Heather Andrea Williams, Help Me to Find My People as well. So I'll drop that in the chat. But thank you for those resources. We appreciate that. And again, there are a few other questions. I can move right into them now, or if you'd like for me to save them for later, whatever you think.
Go ahead, and then because once we shift from here, I'm going into the cadaver trade, and I want to make sure people are. You got to be ready for this next part. So.
Good deal. Okay. You mentioned some movies like Roots that depict the plight of slavery. I teach in upscale New York, sports marketing in upscale New York, in a predominantly Caucasian school district. One of my favorite sports movies addresses the lingering problems. Movies that address the lingering problems was The Express, the Ernie Davis story. I think it's a very powerful story and reached out to all students. Do you recommend any other movies that will have similar effects? And I believe what Eric is quite wondering about is similar effects as it directly relates to enslavement and or the Civil War or Reconstruction.
Yeah. That's a good question. One of my favorite movies that don't know what grade level, it's probably better for high school, and you'd have to give them a trigger warning, but one of my favorite movies of all time is called Sankofa, and it's by a director by the name of Haile Gerima, Gerima, and he has a bookstore in D.C. called Sankofa, and it's a film to me that I think it came out in the 90s, early 90s, 1991, and what it does is it starts off contemporary as an African woman model, and she's taking photographs, and she's being photographed, but she's at the Ghana, Elmina, the slave castle, before the place that people were captured and kept until they were put on ships. The fortifications, the dungeons, those are the terms that scholars are using. Most people are now using fortifications, but she's taking a picture and she gets sent back into time, and all of a sudden she's in the hold, not on the ship, but she's in the quarters where enslaved people were kept before they were put on ships, and she's naked. And she's like, what am I doing here? I'm an African American. Why am I here? I'm not a slave. And all these African enslaved people are surrounding her. And the movie then takes you into her experience on slavery, and it goes through all kinds. I use clips of this film because he covers so much. He covers colorism, he covers, he covers the fact that there's a child that denies his mom, and he I don't want to give away the movie, but there's a lot in there about rebellion, about religion, about family, about community, about resistance that really captures probably the most that I can see in a film on slavery that I think is really, really well done. That's what I would suggest. There are others. There's a number of documentaries that are very helpful. I'm trying to think of them right now. For some reason, I'm drawing a blank on all of their names. But Slavery in the Making of America. That's a little bit older, but it's a good one. Slavery in the Making of America. And what I'm saying, you don't need to show the whole film. You could show a small clip just to teach something that you want to share with them, about the institution, or a scene, and then have them talk about it. That's one way to sort of ease into this history, because it's not an easy history to teach.
Okay. Thank you for that response. It's very helpful. There's also a question from Gregory who says, there was an article published in the Cambridge University Press titled Insuring the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which is about the insurance underwriting of British slavers' voyages. This is, to my knowledge, new research, but could you possibly speak to how this economic factor may have impacted the commercial value of enslaved people?
Yes, the insurance industry also connects to some laws that came out in 2000 where insurance companies that are around today had to, in Chicago in particular, and California has a law where they had to disclose whether or not they had policies on slavery, on whether they were on enslaved people or on ships. So yes, there's a book called Slavery's Capitalism. It's an edited collection, and I think I gave you one essay from there. But there's a woman named Bonnie Martin that writes about insurance policies and slavery. And I think there's definitely there's definitely connections here. And oh my gosh, I'm sorry I'm drawing another blank, but there's a major case. There's a few other ships like the Pearl. There's a story of the Pearl, and there's another one that's all about insurance. And for some reason, it's going to come back to me in a minute. I can't think of the name of this other ship. That most of it was about the story about this particular ship that was captured. Is all about the insurance company and the insurance companies that insure the enslaved. Now, I've also found records of companies where they had policies on enslaved people, life insurance policies from as young as 9 years old up until 65 years of age, so that if something happened to that enslaved person while they were being transported to be sold at a market or transported on a ship, if they died, if they were on a steamboat and the steamboat exploded, that they could get their money back, and that money would be returned through this insurance policy. So a lot of the early policies were like they were from marine companies, marine and fire policies, which doesn't seem like a place you would find enslaved people. But because ships exploded, or the steamboats exploded, they had policies through there before companies started creating their own insurance plans for slave ships. So there's a website by a scholar in London, I think it might be through the University College of London, that did a lot of work on the insurance industry and England and the slave ships there. And I just can't think of the name of it right now. I apologize. But I think if somebody does a search on slavery and the slave trade and put in the University College of London, I think there's a scholar that did, and there's a documentary that covers that same history as well.
Thank you for your willingness to answer those questions. We appreciate it, and I see throughout the chat the conversation is very active, and the participants are all dropping links in the chat, so we appreciate that as well. In the interest of time, we'll hold some of those questions. We're at maybe almost a quarter after now, and so we can proceed. We can move ahead. Thank you again.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. It's my pleasure. So I'm going to move on to showing you all some documents. Just, you can't really see them, but I just want to say a few things that when you're teaching the history of enslaved, there is tons of evidence. Like people, no one can tell me there's no evidence. I've been to the archives, all over the United States, the Caribbean. There are lots of evidence. There's evidence of enslaved people throughout the papers of slaveholding families, both in the North and the South. And if you focus in and you're looking for enslaved people, you will find them. We also have photographic evidence. That's another form of evidence. And lists like the one you see here on the right, a slave list that has like their name and their value. So when I first was doing this research, I was trying to find out about the value. And I just looked for dollar signs. I looked for numeric values associated with people, and I tried to figure out what did that mean and how much do they cost. So here's a broadside or an ad or a poster that would have been hung up throughout the South advertising the sale or the upcoming sale of some enslaved laborers. And you see here some of the terms I told you about. A prime, remember I talked about A1 prime? A prime gang of 25 Negroes accustomed to the culture of Sea Island cotton and rice. And what you see now, how do you read a document like this? When you see the groupings, there's a break in between the groupings. Those are usually family groupings, or those are the ones they're trying to sell together. So you see the first grouping is 3, the second grouping is 5, the third grouping is 7. And you see their names are listed, their ages are listed, and their capacity or their occupation. Carpenters, field hands, prime field hands, right? You see people that are listed as a cook here, a prime field hand. Then you have also notations of people that have physical types of disabilities or they're differently able. You see that, a slight defect in the knee from a broken leg. So that kind of detail is here, and it's in the records, and this is how we can see how they're looking at Black bodies in all of its complexities. You can't necessarily tell on this document, but this was a document that really shaped the way I was able to understand how the values of bodies change as enslaved people aged. So you see, remember I showed you the chart earlier where the price in cottons and the price of slaves kind of went up at the same time? But as enslaved people aged, their values increased. For women, they kept increasing, particularly during their childbearing years. But once they were out of those years, their values dropped off, sort of like a bell curve. They went down. Male enslaved men, their values continued to go a little higher into the early 30s, but women usually, their values sort of started to decrease after 26. So a chart like this from Canebrake Plantation had descriptions of infants, and I had a couple of years in a row of this particular document, so I could see how I could follow specific people and see as they reached different ages how their values increased, or if they were sick or something happened to them, how their values decreased. So it's a commodification and a great level of detail, and it's evidence in the records. So I want to close. We have only about 10 more minutes, but I want to move into this last part that is about the history of ghost values, okay, the values of bodies after they're deceased. And this evidence came from the domestic slave trade. We know that the domestic slave trade, you see this map, many of you have probably seen it before, of the movement on the United States territory, right, or on the United States, where people are moving, and sometimes they're taking ships again along the Atlantic coastline, going down through the Gulf of Florida into the Gulf of Texas and going into there, Gulf of Mexico into ports like the port of Lavaca and the port of Matagorda in Texas. So they talk about going down the Mississippi River or traveling by foot and after the 1840s by train, by steamboat, by ship. So the domestic slave trade moved millions, over 1 million people were moved throughout the domestic slave trade. And your average enslaved person was traded about 4 times throughout their lives. So 4 different times in their lives, they're changing hands. Something to wrap your mind around. So I talk about, on a video that I shared, an infant, but this is a different young woman named Rachel. She was number 29 on this list, which you can't really see from here. But they talk about her. They have the values of some of them, and they say in this advertisement that if you purchase her, the buyers would receive a discount because, quote, her menses are irregular. Now, I always I was shocked. I remember the first time I saw that, to think, how would it feel for someone to be talking about your menstrual cycle in an advertisement that's selling your body? That just seems highly personal, and it just shows the granular level of detail. We have evidence sometimes when they put where they had what we would call like a warranty, a guarantee on a woman's uterus. And there was a court case we found where the woman didn't give birth for 5 years after she was purchased. So the person that purchased her went and sued the person they bought this woman, not Rachel, but another enslaved woman, and they won the case because they had a warranty on her uterus, and she never gave birth to any children, and they received their money back plus interest for like 7 years. Just saying, the level of detail that we see here is very, very shocking, I think. But it's in the records. This is based on the records. So if we look at what happens after they die, I studied the history of slavery for a number of years, and I never knew that Nat Turner, who led one of the largest uprisings in U.S. history in 1831, that he was decapitated. Now, I'm not saying you teach this to your students, but I wanted to give you guys this full context of this history. So he was decapitated, and I had never been taught that. I'd read stuff about him, but I didn't understand that. And there was a fight for his skull among medical students that were there at the time that he was executed. And I was very interested in it, distracted by that. And there's a piece that I wrote in the New York Times about it because I was telling this to my students and they thought I was crazy. And I was talking about how Black bodies, their body parts were being sold through this underground market that I wasn't aware of. And a student in my class said, I don't know what to say. I'm a little embarrassed, but I come from like 4 or 5 generations of medical doctors, and my great has a purse made out of the skin of an African American, a Native American, I think an Asian American. It was multiple races, but it was the purse was labeled, and that just floored me. But it also allowed the students to see that this body trade or body parts trade was real. It brought it home for them in that moment. So a little bit of levity. My supervisor told me to get in touch with my inner slave. That's pretty insulting, her friend says. She says, not really. Mine was Nat Turner. And I just, sometimes you have to bring in a little bit of levity when you're talking about stuff like this. I'm not saying to make humor out of the history of slavery because it's not funny. But sometimes you have to just lighten it up a little bit. So I had to break for that. So now into the domestic cadaver trade. So this was an organized trade in human cadavers where formerly enslaved people and free people, but I just was interested in the enslaved and trying to trace those that had been enslaved, were stuffed into whiskey casks and shipped along the same routes as enslaved people as part of the domestic slave trade, that map I just showed you a few slides back. There were brokers, agents, medical doctors, enslavers, and universities were involved in this illegal trading system. And I found values for the prices of the cadavers. Now, we have ranges of values for enslaved people that went anywhere from $100 to $7,000, and in today's money, $30,000 to $300,000 for one person. This is based on $1860. That's a whole other conversation, but the deceased enslaved cadavers were not that quote-unquote expensive. They were anywhere from $5 to $30 that I could find. And I call these their ghost values. This is after they're dead. And there's evidence of this post-mortem and these bodies that are being traded after death. Now, where did I find this evidence? So one of my graduate students at the time, who's now a professor, identified a letter that was in the archives at Harvard University of 2 physicians that were writing back and forth to one another. One was in Richmond and the other one was at Harvard. And the letter says he's inquiring about the cost of dead, stiff N-words. And they say that I know that is the only commodity that you trade. And like, where can I get one that you won't smell a mile off that you won't smell a mile off. And that was really a key source for me to know that this was some kind of organized trade if they're writing letters and looking for it. And what did they do with these values, these cadavers, was they would sell them to medical schools, and they were used in human anatomy. And I say this all the time, that African American bodies were major research. They were used for research in classes in human anatomy. And so they did these dissections, and medical schools and generations of physicians, early physicians in American history, were trained on the bodies of blacks. And there's a book called Ebony and Ivy, I-V-Y, by Craig Wilder, who writes about the medical schools and about the education there. And that wonderful history and wonderfully written book. University of Virginia, you see cadavers. And one of the things I want you to notice in this photograph is there's an African-American man in the bottom left corner, and there's above that is a skeleton that's been fully articulated. Most of these schools hired and owned enslaved men and their families that they hired to then rob graves and sell to use these graves for their human anatomy classes. They would transport their bodies in bags, such as this bag here, or if they were going short distances. One of the persons that was involved in this trade was a man by the name of Grandison Harris. He was purchased in 1852 by 7 faculty members at the Medical College of Georgia, and he served as the main university grave robber. And he appears, from what I could tell, in almost 25% of the university records, like his name is constantly in there. And the medical scholars, the doctors there, all owned 1/7 share in his body, so that if they left the institution, they could sell the portion that they owned, like the 1/7 of his value, they could sell that back. So even he, who was helping them commodify, he was also commodified himself. But he was also respected among the medical faculty. He was part of the photographs for a number of years, and they had an elaborate celebration of his life after he passed. And I'm going to wrap up soon here. Artist Kara Walker did a piece on the private memorial garden of Grandison Harris, showing him robbing graves here, just to show that this moves into contemporary. And the other gentleman that I wanted to share is Chris Baker. He was a grave robber for the Medical College of Virginia. There is a documentary that the VCU did on his life, and we have evidence of him, and we know about his own burial and his funeral. But he was someone that knew a lot about the human body, and because he had been in the medical college for years, people sometimes would go to him, like students would write in their journals and their books, I wanted to go to talk to Chris Baker because he knows more than anything. He feels more comfortable around the deceased than he does among those that are alive. But I have a question about something related to human anatomy, and I know he knows the answer. So what do we do and what do we make with this history? And how do we teach this to our youth? What parts of it, if any, do we censor? How do we answer questions about treating human beings as property? And how do we grapple with the literal commodification of bodies from preconception to postmortem? And I close with reminding them of African American soul values. That's the last value. It's the value that you have an article about that gives more details, has examples from people like Frederick Douglass, how they valued themselves, and they found by clinging on to their own value and focusing on the value of who they were, and that there was a piece of them that you could not commodify. This one woman says, yes, honey, I was in slavery, but I wasn't no slave. I was just in it, that's all. They never made me hold my head down. And there was a whole parcel of Negroes just like me. We just couldn't be broke. We obeyed our masters and mistresses and did our work, but we kept on saying, deliverance will come. We ain't no hung down head race. We poor, but we proud. I'll close it with her words and the idea of soul values and encourage you to read that piece. But I want to end on freedom, because this is an image of African Americans free in Texas celebrating Juneteenth. This is an early, I think this was taken in 1901, if I remember correctly. It's one of my favorite photographs. They're dressed in their Sunday best. And at these early Juneteenth celebrations, the elders told stories about slavery and made sure the younger generation understood what they had been through, and they were still proud about who they were and where they came from, and they celebrated their freedom, and we celebrate that today. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer more questions.
Wow, thank you so much. There are thank yous that are raining down across the audience chat, and I'm unpacking so much right now and just thinking through everything again from preconception to postmortem. And wow, there were a few other questions I'll bring to you now. And again, from a time perspective, we can extend it a little bit just to go in and maybe answer a few of the other questions. One question we have was, and it begins with a statement. I teach special ed high school in Los Angeles, and I have students from many backgrounds. I recall one student whose mother was African American and Choctaw, and whose mother was non-black Mexican mestiza. His intellectual curiosity peaked when I presented historical lessons about these peoples, but I had difficulty finding instances where there was syncretism between these groups. Do you have any resources where captive enslaved in the U.S. who earned their freedom sought new ties in Mexico or among indigenous people in the Americas, in the West and Midwest?
Yes. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Okay, sorry. I thought I accidentally did something. Okay. Yeah, there are some really good examples of that. There's a book by a scholar named Sarah Baumgarten, and I'm not going to say it correctly, but Sarah Baumgarten, and she writes about, it's called South of Slavery, I think it is, and that's about people who ran away, and enslaved people who ran away to Mexico. Also, one of my former students, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania, Maria Esther Hammock, she writes about those that ran away to Mexico and lived in Mexico. There's a number of scholars, African American, indigenous scholars, that are also writing about indigenous slaveholding practices. So one of my students, former students, Dr. Nakia Parker, she's at Michigan State University, and Brooks Winfrey, both write about, Brooks writes about the intersection between Native people, African people, and white people in Texas, and how these relationships interacted. Nakia, Dr. Nakia Parker writes about enslaved people who were brought along the Trail of Tears with enslaved, with Native communities, and how they were then moved to Indian Territory, which is present-day Oklahoma, and how they maintained systems of slavery within Indian Territory. So those are just a few examples of where you could cover that, and some scholars' work that you can look for on that as well.
Good deal. Thank you. And this one will probably be our last question again for everyone. There are some additional ones, but in the interest of time, we will have to close out shortly. I will say that at the conclusion of the webinar, I'll leave the audience chat up for those who were asking questions as to the availability of resources that were included in the audience chat. I'll leave that audience chat open because as I'm looking and scrolling up, I see there are a number of resources and links that are there. So I'll give you a little bit of time to scroll back up and get those down. But this is a question from Kyle, who's TAing tonight. His question asks, would you say that there is also a value in terms of memory? For example,
Yes.
the power of testimony, witness, and meaning that cemeteries and burial places have.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Kyle, for that question. Absolutely. And it's a question that has often come up in a way when you talk about enslaved people, to sort of, in some settings, to discredit the testimonies of enslaved people. They'll say, well, they were young children during slavery, so how would they know? How would they remember? But that enslaved people share stories that they were told that were passed down to them. It's about respecting oral history. We also have the memories and about places. It's very important to visit these places. I had one teacher wrote me She brought her 8th grade class because they lived in a place that was near a plantation. She brought her class to the plantation and was just thinking about stories that the students told her about memories their parents had and their grandparents had and great-grandparents had about what they knew about that particular plantation. So there's absolutely a value in memory. Absolutely.
All right. And thank you, Dr. Berry, for joining and leading us, as well as sharing your expertise with us all. We've truly enjoyed this experience and understanding and contextualizing the full cycle of evaluation of Black bodies from preconception to postmortem. Thank you to Kyle Tingley, who is in our chat tonight as our TA, for your service on the Teacher Advisory Council, as well as your presence and contributions tonight. I'd encourage you all to keep up with the happenings at the National Humanities Center through our various social media feeds to keep updated on our activities. I'd also like to invite you to check out our next webinar, which will be held Thursday, February the 9th, 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time, entitled Blackface from Time to Time with Eric Lott, Distinguished Professor of English and American Studies, CUNY Graduate Center, City University of New York. Again, thank you again for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again during our Humanities in Class webinar series. We have enjoyed this evening, and again, I appreciate all of the activity in the chat, the energy, the questions. You all have definitely been attentive tonight, and we truly appreciate you. Be safe, and those of you who are out west, stay warm, and we hope that you all have an awesome weekend. Take care.